I call Honi Harawira.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kia ora tātou katoa e te whare. The Māori Party supports this bill in line with the history, the experience and the example that Aotearoa offers the world in terms of the philosophy of peaceful resistance and peaceful leadership. We know only too well the history of the people of Taranaki, who in 1881 refused to fight at Parihaka, instead drawing on their traditions of passive resistance. We all know the international reputation we gained when former Prime Minister David Lange told the world that nuclear weapons were morally indefensible and declared Aotearoa to be nuclear free. We recall the protests against nuclear testing in Mururua in 1985 and the 1996 case that went before the World Court at The Hague. We know that our history tells us that unless the peoples of the land are involved in determining their solutions to conflict, peace will always be fragile and temporary. And we know that the international world must stand strong in condemning any abuse of human rights and democratic freedoms. And, Mr. Speaker, we know too that the stage has been well and truly prepared for this bill to be heard. And so we commend Mr. Graham for putting forward a bill which will restore the opportunity for New Zealand to be a world leader, to get out there and say that we will not violate the United Nations Charter, and that we will not plan, prepare, initiate or execute an act of aggression which violates that charter. In many ways, this bill mirrors Māori Party policy, for we have often advocated for nations to decrease their military expenditure. We seek to maintain a nuclear-free Aotearoa, and we support a peacekeeping role for New Zealand defence personnel in the world. This bill also makes an honourable attempt to hold our leaders to account in the future by determining that our continued involvement in acts like the United States-led coalition's war of terror, now labelled a fraudulent war by most nations outside of the coalition, might constitute an act of aggression illegal in New Zealand law. The events of 9/11 were tragic and disturbing, leading to many changes in the way governments reorganised their defence capabilities, but also the way in which they treated their own citizens. The world watched as the war of terror swept through Afghanistan and Iraq, showcasing the military power of America and the disemboweling of national sovereignty. And New Zealanders watched as this international chain reaction of military enterprise led to our own government executing military actions throughout many communities here in Aotearoa, and the local version of the American war of terror. So there's a lot at stake when we consider the possibility of international non-aggression. Mr. Speaker, we support the notion that this bill would make it mandatory for any New Zealand leader when deciding on deploying our armed forces to a conflict situation to seek and obtain written advice from the Attorney General to determine if the deployment was consistent with New Zealand's obligations under the United Nations Charter. Simple. As I said in the House yesterday, the Māori Party supports Aotearoa committing to activities like peacemaking in Timor-Leste and provincial reconstruction in Afghanistan, rather than unjustifiable military endeavour. And we welcome the introduction of a new crime into law, a crime of aggression, defined as the use of armed force by the state of New Zealand against the sovereignty, territorial integrity or political independence of another state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the Charter of the United Nations. And here's that word, justiciable in New Zealand courts. Mr. Speaker, the Māori Party takes seriously the obligations our nation has on the global stage. We take seriously the obligation to refrain from the use of armed force inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations Charter, and we will support this bill to select committee. Tēnā tātou katoa.